That's what a reckoning sounds like. You wanted to stop, but it just keeps coming.
I told you to shut up!
It's when it stops. That's when you really want to start to fret.
Why? What happens then?
Attack!
Brace yourself.
Hello and welcome back to HateWatchers. Today we're doing the complete season review for the first season of Star Wars Andor. If you want to see a review or breakdown on a specific episode, check out our Andor playlist where we covered each of the 12 episodes. But today we're looking back on the season as a whole and analyzing 4 key areas to determine what Andor did right and where it could have been improved. These 4 areas are the presentation of the show, CGI, set design, costuming, props, music, etc., how the show adhered to or expanded upon the existing lore of the Star Wars universe, the acting, and finally the writing, which includes things like dialogue and storytelling. Star Wars has always been our favorite fantasy universe, and that love has remained, albeit strained, throughout Disney's tumultuous tenure in charge of the franchise. So it was refreshing to see the galaxy far, far away from a new perspective, or from a certain point of view, if you will. And to get a story that wasn't so completely butchered by Disney's need to make everything family-friendly that it makes you puke. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, so let's get into the review. And it goes without saying, but spoilers ahead for the first season of Andor. First up, we have the presentation of this show. Now it's 2022. None of the shows we review here put out by big production studios should have a single problem in this area, because it's all just a matter of money and due diligence. All you have to do is pour millions of dollars into it and run down the checklist. This looks good, check. That looks good, check. This sounds good, check. Yet time and time again in recent years, we've seen productions that cost hundreds of millions of dollars spit out shows and movies that look like shit, that look cheap, or have random moments of embarrassing CGI and effects. Meaning that these wildly expensive projects are cheaping out on the presentation, or more likely they can't be bothered to pay attention to the details of their art. Now that second scenario is troubling. It means, as we've seen time and time again, that the people making the show or movie are not setting out to make art. Rather, they're using it simply as a vessel to deliver some message, be it political or social. But that's a discussion for a different time, as we're veering a little bit off topic. The point is that too often these days, shows and movies have slip-ups in their presentations that are just inexcusable given how much money is being pumped into them. Luckily, Andor is not one of these shows. Attention seems to have been paid to every detail. The CGI, special effects, and most importantly the practical effects are all incredible. We can't think of a single misstep in this area. That being said, the show is a character-driven story, not a fast-paced action adventure, so understandably there's not a ton of effects needed. But when they had to have it, it all looked spectacular. The sets looked fantastic. The gritty, lived-in feeling that the creators were going for really shines through. Before the show came out, the creators made a point of the fact that Andor was using big, real sets to film on, or they were on location. They were shirking the trend at Lucasfilm of overusing something called the volume, a quote virtual filmmaking environment that helped bring the locations of The Mandalorian to life. And it looks like it was the right decision to opt for the real thing. The sets look and feel real, and they perfectly deliver on the creators' promise to show the lives of everyday people in the Star Wars universe. And to that end, each set has just enough classic Star Wars feel to it to remind you which fantasy galaxy you're in without rising to the level of being cheap fan service. The costumes for this show, at the risk of sounding repetitive, look great. Much like with the sets, everything for the most part looks like it belongs in Star Wars. The ISB uniforms all look impeccable. The constantly dirty clothing of the people of Ferrix gives it that gritty look the creators were going for, and everything in between. It just fits every character and every scene. Nothing really feels out of place, and they've just done a great job all around. Now for the props, this is an absolute high point for the show in our opinion. There's so much detail in everything they've shown us this season, and they've been able to capture that nearly indescribable Star Wars look and feel. And I mean, it's really close to being an indescribable look. It's like high-tech and futuristic while still covered in a grimy, industrial, asymmetrical shell. It's one of those things where you know it when you see it, and we saw a lot of it in Andor. The blasters, the Imperial technology, the tools, the gadgets, and of course you knew we were going to mention Luthen's shop here. What a fantastic menagerie of Star Wars Easter eggs and callbacks. Some known, but most were unknown. If Disney were smart, they'd release some kind of picture book going into detail on each and every piece. Star Wars fans would eat that kind of information up, and it's the kind of thing Star Wars once excelled at, and it kept fans involved with the brand long after the credits had rolled. Anyway, Andor gets an absolute A+ in the props department. And finally, we have the music. Would you be mad if I said it was great as well? Okay, the music was, really good. How's that? They were able to use the music to really draw us in during tense and thrilling moments when they wanted to, and it really kicked the show up another level. The only annoyance we had was with the upbeat, housey club music they played when Andor was on Planet Miami. The music was actually fine and pretty enjoyable, but they kept it running well into Andor's arrest scene that would have been better served if they had returned to the typical tense musical buildup. It wasn't a huge mistake by any means, but we think it undermined a pretty dark moment that could have better shown how the Empire was tightening its grip on the galaxy. With everything put together, the first season of Andor truly had an incredible overall presentation. It felt real but fantastical, familiar but new all at the same time. Moving on to the second area of review, we're going over the Star Wars lore that Andor either adhered to, diverged from, added to, or changed. Now, there's not as much to talk about here with a show like Andor as there is with the Rings of Power, let's say. Disney wiped most everything written into Star Wars lore off the board when they took over the brand. They wanted a clean slate to work with for their storytelling, and it's understandable as Legends material, while almost entirely good, has quite a few outrageous stories. Although in hindsight, the move was clearly just all about the Benjamins. As such, for a story on the small scale of Andor with mostly new characters, they're simply not running into much previously charted territory outside of the original movies and Disney's own canon, which is easy enough to stick to. Although that being said, Disney's handling of their own canon is bullshit, but that's a topic for another video. The point is that there's not going to be as many violations of or divergence from the existing lore with a show like Andor, and fans aren't going to be as up in arms over small missteps that are made. The Rings of Power, on the other hand, plucked long-established characters right out of Tolkien's book and made them play act some abomination of a story they attempted to pass off as a Lord of the Rings tale. And the fans were rightfully up in arms about this. For the previously mentioned reasons, you'd never see these kinds of reactions to something like Andor that deals with mostly new characters in a largely untold period of time, a decade after Disney wiped the slate clean of the expanded universe. All that being said, let's review some of the established lore that Andor retconned, beginning with Cassian himself. In Rogue One, Andor says he's been in this fight since he was 6 years old, and other materials detail him hailing from the planet of Fest as being part of a separatist cell fighting against the Republic, and his real mother is dead, but his adoptive mother is very much alive. As you can tell, pretty much all of this has changed. Now Andor is from Kenari. We didn't see much of an organized separatist cell on that planet he was taken from around age 11, and now his adoptive mother is dead as well. Now there's some typical vagueness in what Andor tells us in Rogue One, so he could consider chucking spears at Republic miners on the planet of Kenari at age 6 as, quote, being in this fight. But no one cares about the other changes. I'm sure a significant portion of the fanbase has given up on Disney's canon, but mostly no one cares because Andor isn't a long-time beloved character. These changes don't really change the character, and also he's a thief and a spy. It makes sense for us not to have any real information on his background. Of course, there's also the claim from Andor in Rogue One that being captured by Saw Gerrera's forces and imprisoned was a first for him.
We've been in worse cages than this one. This is a first for me.
Clearly, as we see in the show, Andor was very familiar with being imprisoned. But in typical spy fashion, there's enough vagueness in his statement in the movie that allows people to argue that this was his first time he was behind literal bars. And that's about it. There aren't any other changes to existing lore worth discussing. And given Andor's place in the Star Wars galaxy and timeline, the show is a vessel designed much more so to add to the lore, to further our understanding of larger, more impactful events. Thanks to this, we've seen new planets like Ferrix, Morlana 1, Kenari, and Niamos, and tons of new characters like Marva, Luthen, Vel, Deidre, and Cyril, as well as a long list of new characters in smaller roles. We've also gotten to see things like the inner workings of the ISB, the conditions in daily life in an Imperial prison, the interconnection between the Empire and corporate security forces, and Mon Mothma's personal life at the time she got swept up into the rebellion. And who could forget the life-changing reveal of Star Wars Cocoa Puffs? So all in all, Andor didn't have the usual problems modern shows have had in terms of contradicting established lore, and actually did a fair bit to add to the Star Wars universe. On to the third category of review, the acting. This is going to be a pretty short section, and that's because the acting here was great, top to bottom. Luthen was a real standout. Skarsgård knocked it out of the park. You felt his presence every time he was on screen, and he perfectly portrayed Luthen, a character that's clearly troubled. And that troubled past shined through as Skarsgård expertly carried Luthen through several emotional swings, where he goes from calculating to threatening in a matter of 2 sentences. And he's really led us to believe that there's something more to this character than we know thus far. Even if there isn't anything, we're really looking forward to spending another season with Luthen, largely thanks to Skarsgård. It was also a treat to see Andy Serkis take up another role in the galaxy far, far away, even if we didn't get to spend much time with him. Watching Kino go from useful idiot of the Empire to the inmate most motivated to escape was great, and simply put, Serkis killed it. Let's hope that he's still alive out there somewhere and pops up again, in this show or the next. We'd say that Genevieve O'Reilly also did a fantastic job, even if her storyline wasn't super interesting. She nails the look of Mon Mothma, and the role is hers as long as she wants it. We'd also call out Kyle Soller as Cyril Karn for another good performance. Much like Luthen, Karn's got a lot of emotions bubbling under the surface, and Soller did great letting them peek through just enough. There weren't any bad or even mediocre performances to really speak of. Oh, outside this guy's overacting in this scene, of course. The last area to discuss is the writing. This category includes dialogue, plot, pacing, characters, and storytelling. Andor gets mixed grades among all of these subcategories, but scores high on its writing overall. Starting off with the dialogue, it was good throughout the show with some moments of brilliance.
That's what a reckoning sounds like.
Actually, one of the best things Andor did was cut back on the dialogue and let the actors carry the storytelling. Silence can be just as effective a tool of dialogue as someone constantly running their mouth. There wasn't a single misstep with the dialogue that we picked up on. It did its job and didn't stand out in any negative way. As for the characters, Andor introduced us to a ton of new characters, and for the most part, they were all positive additions to the Star Wars mythos. As is the case in character-driven shows and movies, Andor gave plenty of depth to each character. Very few were one-dimensional, and we became engrossed in trying to figure out everyone's motivations and backgrounds that brought them to where they are at the time of the show. There are obvious standouts like Luthen and Kino. For the rest of the characters, however, we'd have to say that we like them in this story, but aren't clamoring to see them in more Star Wars media. While they fit their roles well in Andor, they're not overly interesting beyond this story. Now for the pacing, we have to give this the lowest grade of the writing subcategories. This first season just didn't need 12 episodes to tell the story it told. It easily could have been cut down to 8 to 10 episodes without losing anything of value, and it would have been punchier at that length. That being said, at least the show did a decent job at avoiding purely filler episodes. There was only one episode this season that was a near complete waste of time. The other episodes that were just there to keep the story moving along had enough relevant plot points sprinkled into them to keep them important. But the season absolutely could have been condensed. Also, we supposedly covered a year of time in this first season, but we don't remember hearing any clear reference to this in the show, and it really didn't feel like a year. Every character seemed to glide directly into their next storyline, and there wasn't much of anything to signify the passage of time. Lastly, we have the plot and storytelling. Both were good, bordering on great, and briefly touching brilliance at times. The first season did a great job of setting and maintaining a tense, intrigue-laden feeling as we jumped from storyline to storyline, seeing the seeds of rebellion being planted in the shadow of the growing empire. We saw Andor squirm his way out of jam after jam, inching towards being a full-blown rebel as the ISB hunted him across the galaxy. We saw Luthen pushing the rebel cause toward more explosive conflict, while Mon Mothma started to doubt his methods while struggling to keep her cover while balancing her own personal issues. We saw Cyril Karn get mentally abused by his awful mother. Most everything was gripping and worth our time. Although we think Mon Mothma's arc was dragged out too long and her storyline lost much of its power and impact by the end. Now, one issue that Andor has is the scope of the show and where the story can go. We already know where Andor's story is heading and where it ends, and that really tempers people's interest in him as a character and even prevented a lot of viewers from even tuning into the show. And while the show has worked hard to build interest in its new characters, there's still just a nagging feeling in the back of our minds that Andor's story has set boundaries and won't venture far from where its story went in the first season. So while the show is great, the story itself feels like it might be constrained to being just good. never being given the freedom to stretch out and touch greatness. Looking forward to the second season, we are a little concerned that Andor may have bitten off a little more than it can chew. As detailed in our season finale review video, they have a tall order in front of them. They need to continue or wrap up some storylines bleeding over from season 1, build upon them and introduce new storylines in the second season, keep us interested in the 30 characters they are planning to juggle, introduce us to new characters, and answer quite a few lingering questions like what's up with Andor's sister? Is there going to be any clarification on the Republic false flag attack we saw in the second and third episode's flashback? And they have to do all of this at a dead sprint, as the second season is going to cover 4 years and lead directly into Rogue One. The second season is going to be 12 episodes just like the first, and each year is going to be seen in its own 3-episode arc. Let's just say that while season 1 could have been 8 to 10 episodes, season 2 will need every minute of those 12 episodes. Good luck. Lastly, we want to mention the post-credit scene showing the construction of the Death Star. We already did a separate video on this, so check that out if you want to hear more on the matter. But we wanted to make another point about the decision to have the parts produced in the Narkina 5 prison used in the Death Star. A lot are going to argue that it helps solidify Andor's place in this galaxy. It brings Cassian's destiny full circle, as he had a hand in making what he later had a hand in destroying. But the key problem with that sentence is the word destiny. Andor isn't supposed to have some grandiose destiny to fulfill, laid out at his feet by the Force like a Jedi. This story is supposed to be devoid of that, focusing on the lives and struggles of everyday people. Cassian isn't a pure-hearted good guy. Shit, we'd argue he's not even morally gray. He's a largely bad dude out for himself and only helps his loved ones if he's not too busy screwing them over first. And it's not in keeping with the Star Wars brand to give this kind of character a grand, positive destiny to live out, without them going through a thorough moral redemption arc. We'll see if this happens in Season 2. Now let's talk turkey with the critical reception of this show. The Rotten Tomatoes scores are very high, with fans giving an 84% rating. We're giving the show a 7.5 out of 10, so it's not far off from the typical score, and we think that the groundwork laid in Season 1 could easily help catapult Season 2 to an 8 or 9. And the discrepancy between our score and the audience score comes from two sources. Us viewing this show through the lens of Star Wars fans and seeing how it fits into our beloved galaxy rather than taking it at its own face value, as well as this nagging feeling in the back of our minds that makes us wonder, while the show is great for what it is, do we really care that much about this story? We're fans, so we're gonna watch it anyway, but there's probably 50 ideas off the top of our heads for Star Wars shows we'd rather see than Andor. Again, the show is great, so let that be your takeaway here. Unfortunately for Disney, just kidding, fuck Disney, the show has struggled to reach viewership numbers that other lesser Star Wars shows coasted to. They even made a somewhat desperate move over the last few days in bringing the first 2 episodes to cable TV to try and drive viewership. We've done a separate video on perhaps why the viewership is low, but the end result is the same. The show didn't get a very high viewership rating, and that will make Disney think twice about producing another show or movie similar to Andor. So it looks like more of the boring Book of Boba is back on the menu. So finally, we've reached that point in the video where we have to decide if Season 1 of Star Wars Andor is a great watch or a hate watch, and it's definitely a great watch. Even though there's only 3 others to stack it up against, Andor is in the running for the best live-action Star Wars show, battling with The Mandalorian for the top spot. And from what we've seen even just in our own comment sections, it really just comes down to personal preference and how that fan defines what Star Wars is to them. Any way you slice it, we think Andor is worth your time and recommend you go and watch it for yourself. Andor is a refreshing take on the galaxy far, far away and shows that any type of storytelling can be viable in the Star Wars universe. Fingers crossed that by some miracle, Disney learns the right lessons from Andor instead of being blinded by the viewership issue and making short-sighted decisions as usual. Thanks for sticking with us to this point in the video. Comment below, what was your overall feeling of Andor's first season? Does your rating differ from the general opinion on Rotten Tomatoes? Are you concerned with how ambitious the creators are being with their goals for Season 2? Let us know what you think. Please consider liking the video if you liked it and hitting the subscribe button below to stay tuned to the channel for more reviews of shows and movies. Thank you again, and we'll catch you on the next one.